Dr. Virginia Scharf, Distinguished Professor of History at the University of New Mexico, joining us this morning, and also the author of several books. One of them, which we're going to be talking about right now, The Women Jefferson Loved. Let me ask you, why is Jefferson still relevant today?
Well, as the author of the Declaration of Independence, I think that's kind of our national scripture, right? The idea that all men are created equal. This is, we just celebrated Martin Luther King Day. You know, this is King expanding on the vision of Jefferson. The wonderful historian Garry Wills has argued that Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is an expansion of the vision of Jefferson. So for all of us, it's really about who's entitled to the privileges and immunities of citizenship. We're still fighting about that. The immigration fight is about that. All of kinds of women's rights, or, you know, the rights of persons of color, all of these things are still at issue. And everybody wants to go back to Jefferson and find kind of, you know, in Jefferson's writing, in Jefferson's world, the nugget of their dignity and their virtue and their citizenship and their humanity. And at the same time, you know, we are very concerned about hypocrisy. And so we see this slaveholder and this guy who reigned as a patriarch in his own world, you know, reigning as a king and railing against a king at the same time. Yeah. And we say, this is our national conundrum. One historian has said, if Jefferson was wrong, then America is wrong. And I think we're still grappling with that. So from my point of view, I believe pretty strongly in the idea that women ought to have the opportunity to do anything they want in the world. For me, the conundrum was, how could a man who'd written these stirring words that created the possibility for the declaration at Seneca Falls that all men and women were created equal, how could he be such a complicated and hypocritical kind of guy? And I think I wrote the book to try to answer that question in my own mind, and came out feeling a little more sympathetic toward him than I expected to.
Yes. How did the women in Jefferson's life help shape his vision for the country?
Well, I think that Jefferson was a man who believed in something he would have called a self-evident truth, something that was so obvious to him that it didn't even bear explaining. And this was an idea that comes down to us, and we still believe it, and that's the idea that in a perfect world, a man should be free to live a happy life and take care of the people that he loved, the people who depended on him. And so from his point of view, all of society should be engineered so that a man could be free to live a happy life and take care of the people who depended on him. And most important on those lists were the women in his family, his mother, his wife, his daughters, the Hemings women, the people who were both dependent on him but upon whom he depended to keep his domestic paradise in order. This was a man who definitely lived in a man's world, but he also lived surrounded by women. 6 sisters, only 1 brother. When his father died when he was 14, his mother raised him until the age of 21, where he then took over the affairs of the plantation. But definitely a man who lived in a house full of women.
Right. And speaking of the women, the title of this book, why this title, The Women Jefferson Loved? I mean, that's a pretty sexy title. Is it, we're talking more about the women that he had liaisons with? People
would say to me, oh, the women Jefferson loved. Well, how many were there, right? You know,
right.
How many at one time? I mean, it does work that way, and of course one wants one's book to fly off the shelves now. But at the same time, I wanted this title to do the kind of work, each word had to do some work. So I wanted the women to come first because I wanted to know about their lives. But I also explored what love meant to Thomas Jefferson and what love means more generally. And when he talked about love, he wasn't talking about a relationship among equals. We have this fantasy that when a man and a woman love each other, that they ought to be accepting each other as partners and equals, and that have the same options open to each other. That's a product of really the last 30 years of history. But he believed in a world where men and women had reciprocal obligations. They were not equal at all. He wasn't talking about women.
They had their roles.
In the Declaration. Absolutely. And men were made to protect and provide for the people who depended on them, and women, including women, and women were made to please and to nurture and to obey. And in a world where they were fulfilling their natural duties, men and women would do this.
Right. And that was Jefferson's view of how it should be.
Absolutely his domestic paradise.
So did Thomas Jefferson fathered children with Sally Hemings. Did he have slave children with one of the slaves on his plantation? I guess that's what everybody wants to know.
Everybody wants to know that, and I think it's interesting why everybody wants to know that. Why do we care whether this happened?
Same reason we read the National Enquirer, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I think it's partly that, but I think it's also a matter of wondering about, what is it that makes the Founding Father tick? We used to have this vision of American history where it was all kind of great white men who seemed as if they lived in absolutely in isolation. There was nobody around them. They thought their great thoughts. They occasionally battled with one another, but there was nobody around them. And I think the question about whether a man like Thomas Jefferson, who writes the Declaration of Independence, has an affair with his slave, more importantly, has a kind of long-term relationship in which children are involved, and does he care about this? I mean, this takes him out of the context of a marble statue in a godly pantheon, or the bust that is in the Library of Congress or whatever, the portrait in the National Portrait Gallery, and it puts him into a real world inhabited by real people. The answer to your question is that I think the best evidence suggests, and most historians believe who've thought about this matter in a fair-minded way, that Thomas Jefferson is most likely to have been the father of the Hemings children. There is DNA evidence that a Jefferson male fathered at least one of her children, her youngest son, Eston Hemings, who by many accounts was said to look an awful lot like Thomas Jefferson. Sally Hemings was his wife's half-sister. He was very, very grief-stricken when his wife died. Only after 10 years of marriage, she died because of repeated difficulties with childbearing. He was 42 years old at that time, and somebody who really believed in the notion, I think, of sentiment and of romantic love, and did love his wife by everything I have been able to figure out. I think they had a passionate marriage, and I think that he promised her on his deathbed that he would never marry again, but of course, her mother had died bearing her, and she was raised by Sally Hemings' mother, who had...
Interesting crossover.
And Sally Hemings' mother, Betty Hemings, had 6 children with Martha Jefferson's father.
Wow.
So she brought these enslaved half-brothers and sisters into Jefferson's household. She instructs him on her deathbed never to marry again, surrounded by her own 2 surviving daughters. There was a baby who would die shortly thereafter. And the Hemings women in this room, including little 10-year-old Sally Hemings at this time. Wow. And so for her to say, I think in some ways it's saying to him, not a marriage. I don't want stepmothers for my daughters. Right. What else you do, you're going to have to figure out.
Right.
And by many accounts, Sally Hemings was a beautiful woman. She is somebody who had 1 African grandparent and 3 English grandparents. Right, so if you think about it that way, this is somebody whose racial identity is very, very mixed, but it's fixed because she grew up in Virginia at that time. She's born to a slave mother, and she's born in Virginia, ergo she's black and enslaved. But it's much more complicated than that.
Why do we care so much about Jefferson's private life? I mean, it is interesting to us. We have a fascination with what things were really like beyond what we know from what our history books teach us.
Well, Augusta, I was almost going to say, well, lately, we want to care about private lives of politicians, but in fact, people have cared about Thomas Jefferson's sex life ever since he had one.
Wow.
So, the scandal begins to emerge when he is probably, I think, really around the 1790s when he's first really getting into politics in the country.
Even during his lifetime.
Yeah, and it really bursts forth when he's president of the United States, and it's published by this guy, James Callender, and the Federalists are trying to make hay about it, and it emerges again and again over American history. And I think in many ways it's about the question of, are we really a nation of black and white people, or are we a nation of people? Are the races really separate? And I think, people can't quite square the idea that people would care about each other regardless of race if they're trying to maintain those racial boundaries.
Sure. And Thomas Jefferson really embodied, he was called a Renaissance man. He really was sort of a unique individual of his day, and yet he had a soft heart for the women who surrounded him.
I think he had a soft heart. I think he expected them to please and obey and nurture him. But at the same time, he really cared about them. He wanted his daughters to be learned. He said that he wouldn't have thought much about educating his daughter Patsy, except he calculated her chances of marrying a blockhead at 16 to 1. So he wanted to make sure that she'd do okay with the household accounts and so forth. And he loved them.
Yeah.
He wrote extremely affectionate letters to them. He used the word love a lot. So this was somebody for whom these relationships were not just matters of duty, but also matters of deep emotion.
Even being a slaveholder, there were some truths that he still held dear and true to his own heart.
I think he made promises that he would protect and provide for them, and that Patsy would have Monticello and be able to live out her days, and that nobody would, deprive her of her security. But the problem was that he could not control his finances. He liked to spend money. He was a little bit of a shopaholic. He was a planter at a time when being a planter was an economically absolutely unsustainable thing to do in Virginia. So he dies $100,000 in debt.
Wow.
He had promised her Monticello, he had promised her security, he had promised he'd protect her, and he leaves her destitute, broke, and depressed, and homeless, really. So he couldn't keep his promises to her.
Much as he wanted to.
It broke his heart, absolutely broke his heart. On the other hand, he promised Sally Hemings that their children would go free. And all of her children went free. So ironically, the person to whom he kept most of his promises was Sally Hemings.
How do you feel about Jefferson after writing this book?
I admired Jefferson from the time I was a little kid. I grew up in St. Louis, and we used to go to the Jefferson Memorial, which is a great museum, and they had a big statue of him. Yes. And then when I started being more interested in women's history, and I started finding out about his ideas about women and how women shouldn't go into politics and shouldn't have jobs and should just please their husbands and their fathers, I was kind of mad at him. The deeper I got into this, the more I saw that he was, like many of us, doing the best he could in a bad situation, in a hedge situation. He was trying to fulfill his vision of himself as men of the time envisioned themselves.
Why do you care about Jefferson today, and what ramifications does that have as we move forward, especially with the political climate we're in right now?
Well, I think that people's private lives do matter, but not necessarily because we should censure them if they ever fall down, right? If they ever do something wrong. I don't really have a problem with Thomas Jefferson having a complicated family. And I think, for many years, historians, and particularly white male historians, defended the idea that Thomas Jefferson was this, kind of pillar of righteousness that would never do anything wrong. Oh, yes, well, he had slaves, but he really hated slavery. Or, well, he had a passionate relationship with his wife and, loved dogs or whatever. Right. But Jefferson had a complicated interracial family. He had a shadow family. He lived in a house divided. And we all have really complicated families.
Right. Here we're saying Jefferson had this interracial, marriage and complicated family. Shouldn't that be okay?
I would say that the interracial family that he had was for a long time cast as a weakness or a sin. Or something that was unmentionable. And I see it simply as something that is complicated and, as a historian, fascinating. And I also think, if we give up this picture of Jefferson as a marble statue, as a perfect man, as the founding father with the capital Fs, that we gain something more, So what? Yeah. If he has the complicated family? We all have that, and what we get is a founding father who's not just for perfect people, but a founding father for all of us.
Virginia, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.